Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and DrDemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Scott McDonald of Dr. Demographics. Today we're going to be talking about the urban, suburban, and rural practice sites. Now, there are far more than just three flavors of location that you should look at. But nevertheless, it seems that this covers the majority of sites that you might want to think about. I want to talk to you about what each of them are and what benefits and liabilities exist in each of these practice type locations. So we're going to be talking about urban, suburban, and rural practice sites. Which one is best? Let me say this right off. I don't believe there is one that is going to be good and another that is bad. There are just those that have relative strengths and relative weaknesses. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this episode. Now, right now, today, there are huge numbers of doctors who are starting the process of selecting and evaluating sites in which to set up practice. This is a new trend. We haven't seen this many people on the market. Normally, we would assume that they could go to a practice broker or a realtor and find locations that would work within the areas that they're in. But that isn't quite what's happening. What we're seeing is a significant stress that's happening to those wanting to start up a practice or purchase an existing office. Now, doctors seem to feel that there is a limited number or are a limited number and diminishing number of existing practices for sale, and that the interest rates are getting higher along with the price of existing practices with a healthy patient base. And lastly, we see that there is a shifting demographic. And in fact, they're narrowing about where they can go. So we're seeing more places that are not working for doctors and a science of setting up what is working and what's really hoping will work over a period of time. Some states are pricing themselves out of the market. I will say that, well, definitively. There are some places that it is so expensive and so difficult to set up a practice or purchase a practice that a lot of people are thinking outside the box. Where can I go? What can I do? Now, I will say this. I believe that owning a dental practice is by far the best way to go. I think it has the long-term prognosis of profitability and more flexibility in what you can do with a practice site. So you want to understand what I'm saying in this episode. But this is, in fact, one of the most important episodes that I've delivered on Dr. Demographics, so I hope you'll listen carefully. Are your hopes and dreams to owning your own practice going to come to nothing for a long time in the future? And some people are saying, hey, right now there are not practices that I can get into profitably, so I'm not even going to think about it. I think it is a wise thing at least to go through the planning process of thinking, what is going to work for me and when will it work for me? Now, in my opinion, owning a practice is still the smart move, regardless of the location type. So I think now is the time to start doing investigations. There are no simple answers, and guarantees of success, well, they're rare. But there are a few places or a few things that you should know if you want to make wise choices and to avoid unnecessary risks in setting up a practice. But you've got to do the thinking right now. The type of location for a successful practice can help guide your decisions and influence your successful outcomes. Now, let me review the difference in location types. Now, remember, we're a demographic company, and our job is to work with brokers and realtors and doctors on finding out what is a good place for you to go. I'm not going to say that these are the only places to go or that they're perfect, because they certainly are not. But let me review those differences in location types that you are going to run across. Dr. Demographics is all about selecting the best places to practice. Now, keep in mind, that good rural, suburban, and urban locations can be found in every state. Some locations are going to be superlative. Some are going to be kind of risky. But I want you to know what's on the market and what my process is that I'm thinking about advising or how doctors are making decisions on what to do. Now, right now, suburban sites carry the least amount of risk. This is true. Almost all demographers know it, and they're talking about it. And I just thought you ought to hear this, well, from me. So how do you define a rural location, and what are its benefits and liabilities? There are benefits and liabilities to every kind of site. Now, put it this way, there are a few cliches right at the beginning that we should probably eliminate. Number one, rural usually refers to lower population density, not the character of the people who live there, but rather how many people live in a unit of space. In a way, this represents less cost in the purchase of an existing practice. Now, two, it does not mean that the site has less education in its population or money or has a political point of view that may be negative for you. You see, race and ethnicity may be somewhat different from national norms, but rural locations can be found with all kinds of demographic trends. So I say if you kind of get a feel that you'd like to consider a place that has a low population density, rural locations are terrific. Housing is not necessarily different than the nation, but the cost of living in low density sites will be relatively lower. So a rural site is usually where people like to start if they don't have a lot of money, because a population will grow and increase and become more complex over time. Not all rural sites are increasing in population size at the same rate. So a lot of people say, well, I want a rural site. Well, that's a noble thought. But you see, housing is not necessarily different just because it is rural. Not all rural sites are increasing in population at the same rate, is what I just said. What that means is they may be growing, but they're not growing as fast as other sites. An urban site may actually grow faster than a rural site, just because it starts off with a larger population. Rural locations may vary in their potential to house new healthcare practices, but the re-educated population size brings some greater risks due to smaller populations. So I want you to think of rural sites as having potential because they're going to reform themselves in time to become more densely populated and more affluent. Now, some rural locations can have urban pockets, but they are the exception to the rule. So if you have a low density population, it can be really terrific, but it may take a while for the population to move in and flush out that population. Now, the benefits of a rural site, there are quite a number of them. Let me move my little photograph up higher. Rural sites almost always have lower rates of crime, both crimes against people and crimes against property, which are the two main types that are tracked. Rural locations have the perceived benefit of quality of life. So in other words, you may go into an area that doesn't have crime and doesn't have a lot of population, but it's a desirable place to live. Cost of living and cost of doing business are often, but not always, generally lower. So that is a good thing for them. Now, competition is a good thing. You don't want to go into a site that has no competition, because that just means you're going to have to struggle for a while as the area changes. The employment rate, meaning the number of people who are employed in an area, the labor participation rate, that means the percentage of people who are employed, and the salary rate is often lower in a rural site. Significant growth potential can occur because there is more room for an expansion. Now, I live in a state they consider rural. I'm in Utah. Doesn't mean it's going to have a lot of rich people and that people are going to come in huge numbers. But it means with the growth of single-family dwellings and the increase in a population over time, Utah and other states like it are showing a lot of promise, and that's what I'm telling you. Now, there are some negatives to rural sites. Here are a few. They often lack public amenities like restaurants, entertainment venues, universities, and theater. It matters a lot to some doctors, but it doesn't matter to others. But it is a statement, nevertheless, of the nature of rural sites. They do not generally have proximity to a large and growing population. In other words, rural sites tend to be isolated. For some people, that's great. For some, it's a hardship. Transportation may be difficult when thus making commutes longer. A rural site doesn't have very many freeways, but it doesn't necessarily have an overabundance of people, making it more difficult to practice there. Now, these sites have less variety of lifestyles and ethnic flavors, and that matters a lot to some people. For many people, this is not important. For others, well, it can be really quite vital, particularly if you're looking at one language group or a nation of origin. Rural sites tend to have that in common with each other. So if you're looking for help in evaluating how good is this area, Dr. Demographics can tell you what the types of people and their lifestyles and nations of origin and languages spoken in that particular area. And this can be invaluable to you to making your practice successful right out of the gate. Now, there are some political diversities, but they're going to look limited. So in other words, people are going to be either Democrat, or they may be independent, or they may be whatever. And because of that, you may be a little frustrated that people in rural locations tend to have a certain similarity to each other in terms of lifestyle. That's to be expected, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an artifact of rural sites. Now, how do you define an urban location? Let's switch over from rural to urban. And what are the benefits and liabilities of a practice in these particular locations? As with rural sites, there are misconceptions about urban locations. Urban actually refers to a higher population density, not the character of the people. High-rise apartments are very common, for example, as a type of housing. Single-family homes are rare and, well, they may be exceptionally expensive and have high mortgages. That's a truth with urban housing. Now, it does not mean that the site has more education, although universities are more common in urban sites. And a lot of doctors prefer to be in a place where they can teach or receive the benefits of a university near where they are living or practicing. It does not mean, though, that these education centers, like a university, while more common, is not the answer to all of the problems that you're facing. Because of demographic variations, race and ethnicity hubs are not unusual. Urban areas tend to be the gateways for first-generation immigrants. Still, political viewpoint tends to be liberal. Now, I mean that politically liberal. Some people like that, some people don't, but it's a truism with urban sites. They tend to have a political character to them. At the present time, urban centers are not growing in populations in almost every city in America. The cost of living is increasing, crime is increasing, taxes are increasing, and this is a big reversal of 20 years ago. You see, everybody wanted to go to an urban site because they believed that urban people had more money. It was a more desirable thing for them to do. But urban centers, cities that have an urban hub, are actually losing population. And that is a truism that's true in every part of the country. Chicago, New York, Boston, the city centers are losing. Now, the pandemic sparked an increase in the desire of inner city communities to flee. In other words, people were getting sicker in cities, and urban centers were not popular for that reason. And so people generally have moved out of the city centers. It's true for Chicago. It's true for Seattle. Some urban locations may have suburban pockets, an area that has people who are living a lifestyle like a suburb, but it's usually a fairly small area within their major city. But they're losing to the true suburbs while the rural pockets are not growing. Now, the suburbs right now are the low-hanging fruit of most cities. That's where people are moving into. They're growing. Urban centers and rural centers are not. And it's a general truism some people will disagree with, but it's a fact. There appears to be serious tension politically between urban and suburban sectors in the U.S. And that's because rural areas are out of the conflict. So no one cares about a very low population density. But urban and suburban areas are proving to be more different from each other in terms of their lifestyle. It may be because the suburbs are winning the fight for congressional representation and the urban areas are losing. So let me explain. If you went to a major city, the number of House of Representative members and other indicators of political strength are actually declining. That bothers a lot of people. It kind of means that they're not going to be the ones who are dictating what's going to happen in the future as far as a community. Urban areas get less say as they get less representation. That is why the suburbs and the urbs or urban areas are in conflict. It's representation. Now let's go back to talk about the benefits of an urban site. Healthcare practices are greatly benefited by medical and dental schools, as an example. They're the recipients of research and teaching funds, and there are certainly more jobs in healthcare in an urban area. You all know that instinctively. Urban areas have far more restaurants and entertainment and transportation hubs and established institutions which add a center of gravity and offer quality of life attractions. That's why people move to a downtown. The attractions. Now, urban areas tend to have very large employers too. There's a lot of work in big cities. This brings the patient base closer to the office, and the results in a site that are more conveniently located. So a lot of people think urban areas are the best. But you know what the downsides are, don't you? With more population, there is more turnover in the residents. We sometimes forget that all practices are benefited by new patients who arrive to take the place of those who have moved away, retired, or passed on. That's one reason why urban sites are losing population. Urban centers have a source of employees, patients, or referrals, and the greater the initial patient population, the more treatment that can be initiated. So there's more interesting cases in urban areas. There's more people who are potential patients. They have more money. There are more doctors to treat these people. Inter-practice referrals are enhanced because there are more patients in a more densely populated location. So Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles share these benefits. There are just more people to be treated. But there are other disadvantages, and perhaps we ought to take a moment to talk about them. Here's the negatives of the urban sites. Urban sites are more expensive. The cost of operating a practice, including the cost of facilities and employees, is not insignificant. As you look at an urban versus a rural versus a suburban site, The urban sites are much more expensive. Dense populations can be harder and more expensive to promote for urban sites. Competition can be much greater in an urban area as well. There are more providers in a smaller geographic area. Urban areas have more crime. There's a hidden cost that keeps doctors and employees and patients away, and that is the expense of crime. Parking access and site security are much greater in urban areas. Altogether, the viability of an urban location is becoming questionable as the exodus of the population of urban sites becomes greater. It is, in fact, accelerating. There's a long-term trend which appears to be accelerating all large urban centers, and they're experiencing this phenomenon. In short, people in the San Francisco Bay Area are moving out. New York City, the same thing. In the fringe areas and the downtown suburbs are doing better, potentially better. So it is a bit of a trade-off as we look at why one site is doing better than others. Now, how do you define a suburban location and what are its benefits and liabilities? Now, there are some myths about suburbs as well, and we should talk about those. Suburban sites are not growing. The truth is, suburban sites are growing faster than any other kind of site, but just because it is a suburb doesn't mean it is growing like crazy. One of the biggest advantages of suburban locations is the relative savings in cost and overhead of doing business, including the employee costs. It costs much less to hire employees to work in a suburban site. Urban sites, it can be quite pricey. Suburban locations are not as interesting as urban centers. This is kind of a slam against the burbs. They're boring. Well, they may be, but the truth is you're safer and there's more people moving to the suburbs than to urban areas, as I was mentioning. Now, it is true that we don't have as many attractions in an urban area, but they also have less competition as a general rule. So you'll do the calculation on how many providers there are in an area, and you'll generally see that a suburban site doesn't suffer from competition as much as an urban site. It is also true that crime is greatly reduced in the suburbs. Staffing is easier. The other costs that make overhead is less of it in these locations and can be more profitable. So it doesn't cost as much to be in a suburban site as it does an urban one. Accessibility to these locations are often facilitated by freeways and large surface streets in a suburban location. That doesn't happen as much in urban areas where the time that it takes to get from point A to point B is much greater. So accessibility to these locations are often facilitated by the transportation arteries. Reduced crime is a major benefit. Crime is actually being reduced as local residents are, happier with living in a place that's suburban. Some rural locations have urban pockets, it is true, but they're the exception and not the rule. Employers and residents are building in those locations at an increased rate. So everybody knows that the suburbs are really where people ought to look to place a practice that doesn't exist already. But there are some negatives to suburban sites. Prices and availability is making this a less desirable option, but it may be the best remaining option that many healthcare professionals have. So are people going to move out of the suburbs? Yeah, probably, but not at as great a rate as in the urban areas. Many states are regulating against suburban sites, especially, for instance, California, by eliminating single-family neighborhoods and encouraging multi-dwelling lots. This means that it's a much better use of infrastructure investments. This is not proving very popular. So let me just back up. In a suburban site, there are a lot of laws that are being passed right now that allows a person to open up a practice that used to be reserved for single-family dwellings. But they're no longer protecting those sites, and California is kind of leading the way. Some suburban sites are really urban sites that are disguised as suburban dwellings. Traffic patterns are proving untenable. And I mean by that, what used to be a place that you'd say, oh, well, the burbs is easy to go to and less expensive to travel to and takes a shorter time. But that isn't holding true in all areas. The price of housing in these suburbs are rising very fast. So if you look at a suburban site near a major urban center, you may say you kind of have it all, but the truth is they're becoming rarer and more expensive. So what I'm telling you is I've examined locations that are suburban. It used to be true that they were less expensive, but that's losing its potential. Suburban sites are being more expensive and more crowded than they ever were before. And that's why I mentioned the price of housing in these suburbs is rising quickly. Now, the benefits of a suburban site. The quality of life is almost always maintained. So a suburb is a safer, better investment as far as the price of a property. Energy efficiency is rising in suburbs far faster than in urban areas. So you go to an urban area, it can be really pricey. Residents prefer a community model. It is what people want. So in other words, people want to go to a suburb. It's not crowded, has low crime, is less expensive, has less competition. That's the major trend. Crime tends to be diminished in suburban sites. Small businesses have more options in which to operate in suburban sites. The closest population centers to business centers are in suburban sites. Retail sites are more affordable, and growth seems to be more easily accommodated. Now, I recognize a lot of the things I've said may seem internally to contradict themselves. But right now, suburban locations are more affordable to put an option, a business, a practice. Rural sites have less population and are therefore less attractive to build up a practice. Urban sites are losing population, and it's becoming more difficult to open a de novo practice in those areas. Now, let me read some tea leaves. In other words, I'm going to predict the future. City planners hate suburban sites. They will do almost anything they can to kill the suburbs. Governments don't like them either. They can't collect taxes as easily. They can't control businesses and populations easily. Residents and property owners like suburban sites, and they like them a great deal. Governments and city planners want to fight the suburbs. And if you're ever looking for an internal disagreement, go to a city council meeting or a planning commission meeting, and they are whining constantly about low population density suburbs. They prefer the urban model, easier to control, easier to collect taxes, but not as affordable for you. Now, in many places outside the empty quarter, and this is the area between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians, rural areas are being priced out of the existence in spite of their popularity. Yeah, everybody knows living in a rural area, well, you can have a nicer house, your kids can have a better experience. Schools tend to be better in rural areas. But rural areas are not likely to disappear anytime soon because people like them. The U.S. has enough spaces in the West easily to meet the demand of a rural property. On the East Coast and in the Northwest, it's not as easy to find a place that is not overly or overdeveloped now and therefore too expensive. Suburban sites are where growth is to be found. So that's what I'm saying. If you want to do the smart move, start up something, really make a go of it, suburbs are probably the smartest way to go for now. If you want to know more about this, please visit us at drdemographics.com. Our telephone number is 800-849-0499. If you'd like to talk to me about a specific location or its potential, I'm happy to do this as a telephone consultation. The consultations are depicted in our website, and I hope you'll take a look at them. And thank you so much for watching.